welcome back, everybody, to the Polycon UK webinars. It's my pleasure today to have Elaine from Washington University St. Louis. She'll be talking to us about tactical choice and repeated protests. Just a reminder, these talks are normally about 50 minutes plus 10 minutes for question and answers, but we play a bit by ear. And also another reminder, it is being recorded. And finally, that next webinar is November 3rd. Leah Bustan will talk to us about intergenerational mobility of immigrants in 15 destination countries. If you go to our webpage, it's listed as with co-authors because there's a lot of those. All right, Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to discuss my ongoing work on tactical choice and repeated protests. As Francesco mentioned, I'm at WashU in St. Louis. I'm in political science, but you should still feel free to interrupt me freely. Okay. So let's get started. So I want to start with a pretty simple question, which is how and why do protest movements choose to change tactics over their lifetimes? So for instance, the African National Congress and its long struggle against apartheid initially protests using tactics that largely look like peaceful civil disobedience. But after these tactics are run into stiff resistance and it seems like they're not really accomplishing anything, the leaders of the ANC, including Nelson Mandela, really consciously make the decision to turn instead to armed resistance and insurgent struggle. This, of course, is a pretty historically sort of a widespread phenomenon. So another example has tactical change over the scale of days or weeks rather than decades. So if we think about the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, these really started with mass student-led marches. But as Mark Beisinger writes, as the students returned to class, the movement began to dwindle. And to kind of recover momentum, a small group of radical student activists begin on an extremely kind of visible hunger strike. And this hunger strike actually leads back to sort of mass marches or sort of mass occupation of Tiananmen Square. Up to 1 million citizens mobilized, but as we know, this is ultimately stifled by the imposition of martial law about a week later. So again, we see this kind of fluctuation between sort of mass tactics and more targeted kind of tactics that use a smaller group of people. So I want to start with asking how protests choose between more and less turnout sensitive tactics across repeated mobilizations. When do they use sort of mass marches versus, car bombings or hunger strikes? And I want to make the pitch that even if you're an empirical scholar, this should matter to you. So if we care about, say, the occurrence and efficacy of mass marches versus insurgencies, we should realize that the tactical choice itself is endogenous to the strategic environment created in part by past protests. And this is something, choice of tactics is something that many empirical scholars in political science do seem to care a lot about. So, can we think about how protest tactical choice evolves in tandem with learning about regime strength in a model in which turnout itself is endogenous? So I really want to unpack this last bullet point because this is really the sort of meat of the model that I'm presenting today. So I'm really trying to highlight the coevolution of three things that are very closely bundled in the model. The first one, of course, is whether a protest chooses tactics that are more or less sensitive to turnout to generate power. The second thing is public beliefs about the strength of the regime or status quo. And these beliefs become more informed and pessimistic as unsuccessful protests accumulate over time. The game ends with a success. So the more that we try and fail, the more we come to believe that this regime must indeed be quite strong. And the last ingredient is essentially just the logic of collective action. So this is how global games is going to enter into the model. Individuals who, in my setup, will share beliefs about regime strength are going to choose whether or not the protest based instead of on signals regime strength, instead on their signals of their cost of participation. So you're going to see this very soon. So let me flag where I'm going with this talk. So the first contribution I really want to make is essentially a technical one. So as I'm sure many of you know, if we sort of just repeat a standard vanilla global game, we get equilibrium multiplicity, which sort of takes away the whole point of using global games in the first place. This is the upshot of the Angeletos, Helwig, and Pavon paper of 2007. So my paper is offering one way to kind of get around this. And the idea is, again, to assume that everyone has common beliefs about the strength of the regime. And the thing that's really driving your turnout decision is instead your realized cost of participation. So this is the technical contribution. The next one is more of a substantive or applied insight, which is that tactical choice in the model is going to be responsive to both retrospective and prospective incentives. So retrospective incentives are essentially the fact that we learn about regime strength from the past. And this is going to look a little bit like experimentation. Whereas the prospective incentive is the fact that we can use tactical choice in this model essentially to hedge for the future. And this is going to create an incentive essentially to manage public optimism, to sort of control the kind of beliefs that can be realized tomorrow based on, that will happen tomorrow based on realized protests today. So the kind of implication of this, which I'm still working through and hopefully you'll give me some feedback on, is that different kinds of tactics, so the kind of technologies available to us, are going to emphasize either the forward-looking or kind of backward-looking lever. And these will result in different paths of protests. They're going to affect what tactic you would like to use initially. They're going to affect the amount of alternation that we see. Are we really going to stick to one tactic, or do we see alternation over the lifetime of a protest? And essentially, which tactic seems more appealing kind of across the lifetime of a protest? And finally, there's possible extension, which I used to think would be kind of more central to the paper, but you can tell me what you think about it. And this extension essentially has to do with instead of allowing a kind of a social planner to choose the tactic, it would instead allow incumbents or say a biased organizer to choose tactics instead. And the reason why this might seem interesting is that it will create possible distortions in both kind of experimentation and in managing the future. And it seems that we would see both sort of over and under experimentation. But this is a largely speculative aspect of the paper for now. I'll very briefly flag lit review. There's a large and growing literature using global games to think about collective action and protests. There's a number of these that are starting now to think about dynamic regime change games. This has been, of course, sort of technical limitation of the literature. And there have been a number of approaches to this, right? So the little paper is essentially just taking the Angeletos et al. Framework kind of wholesale to think about coups. Other papers are instead thinking about one attack that you could join at multiple times. The Yashevsky and Kochak paper is about adding a kind of altruism parameter that induces agents to kind of care about the future. So there have been different ways of doing this, but I think the framework you'll see from me is going to be something quite different from all of these. And the other thing I want to flag in largely the formal literature is that these regime change games are usually not so interested in tactical choice, right? Protest is just a binary decision, you join or you don't. But a literature in which you do see people caring more about tactical choice is models of rebel tactics or insurgency. So this is largely in the more conflict IR space in political science. Okay. Oh, I went back. Okay, so if there are no questions, we'll just get to the model. Uh, I cannot, if anybody is raising their hand, I don't know if I can see, so you'll have to speak up. But let's talk about the model. So
We'll
the
keep track of
fundamentals,
that.
sorry?
We'll
Oh,
keep track, so don't worry about that.
thank you. So protesters in this model can either be, we'll call it a people power or a disruptive type. The type is essentially indexing the kind of tactic that you're willing to use or participate under. And I'm going to assume that there's a unit mass of each type. I'm going to assume that there are two periods, although we can use the kind of implied dynamics to think about more. And at the beginning of each one of these periods, an organizer is going to choose either sort of mass or people power versus disruptive tactics. Each potential protester is going to observe this choice of tactics. They're going to observe their realized cost of participation, and then they choose whether to join the protest or abstain. So what is this cost of participation? So using a global games approach, kind of with a tweak, a Tau type agent, so for instance, a disruptive agent's cost of joining a protest with their aligned tactic is essentially going to be the sum of two components, a common shock and an idiosyncratic shock. So C tau IT, so the cost to protester I at time t who has type tau, say disruptive, is going to be this common component, C tau t, plus their idiosyncratic component, epsilon tau IT. And I'm going to make this really simple. So both of these shocks are essentially going to be drawn IID uniform each period. To preserve two-sided limit dominance, we have to assume essentially that the bottom of the support of the common shock has to be less than zero. So there's always some people who are willing to participate. But essentially, these two things are just going to be drawn uniform. And I'm going to assume that an agent's cost of taking their non-aligned action is infinite, which essentially is just assuming that a protester only ever joins when the protest tactic aligns with their type. This is not a super essential assumption. I'll mention it in a second down the road. So then my individual flow payoff is going to be this participation cost, which I just discussed. And I incur this participation cost whenever I participate, irrespective of whether or not the protest succeeds. And then there's going to be private benefits. So if I participate and the protest succeeds, I just get a kind of benefit of one. And then this public benefits side is not extremely essential for the baseline model. But if we did want to think about an extension in which incumbents get to choose tactics, then it might be useful to have public benefits to give protesters an incentive to essentially pass the torch. So that's why I have this kind of non-standard public benefits term in the payoff. So
Can
then
I
my
ask
total
a
payoff,
okay,
yes,
quick question? Are you going to talk to us about these uniform distributions, what the domain is,
the
or
domain,
not? Well, I
okay,
see here
sorry.
in this yeah, the footnote is
Yeah,
clear about C tau T,
D tau
but
T.
is the epsilon, do all the I's have the same distribution? Is it, for example, a 0, 1 distribution, or what is it?
Yeah, sorry, I should have made that clear on the slide. So all the i's have the distribution of epsilon is the same for all the i's, but I'm not imposing kind of strong assumptions on what that distribution is.
And do they depend on the taus or not? These
So
epsilons.
down the road, they could. For the purposes of this talk,
Okay.
that's not going to be important. The distribution of epsilon is essentially going to tell us how wide the distribution of costs is in any given protest. So the kind of
Mhm.
larger epsilon is, the more agents there will be that have really high cost of participation and really, really low cost of participation. So epsilon is kind of going to be this sort of width parameter. Okay, great. So the total payoff is going to be just the discounted sum of the first and second period payoffs. So what is this tactics parameter I've been talking about? So at each time t, the protest can either use essentially people power or targeted disruption. I'm being a little ambiguous about exactly what these can be, but you can think of these as like marches and like insurgent tactics. So each one of these tactics, so AP is going to be the function for people power tactics and AD for disruptive tactics, is going to be a production function which maps turnout, which is the proportion of aligned agents participating. So how many of this unit mass of agents show up. So it maps turnout to power. And I'm going to make some assumptions on what these technologies can look like. So here's an example of what's permissible. And the key idea is that when nobody shows up, the sort of violent or disruptive tactic is going to be more powerful. So when turnout is zero, the red one is higher. When turnout is one, the sort of people power tactic is more powerful. And violence, importantly, is always less sensitive to turnout than the sort of people power tactic. So this is just a linear example. It's not the only thing that satisfies these assumptions, but it's useful to think about something that would not satisfy these assumptions. So this would not be permissible because we're violating the assumption on the slope of the tactics, right? So this example would be one in which there's some ranges of turnout in which disruptive tactic is more sensitive to turnout than the sort of people power tactic. So this is the kind of technology that I'm ruling out in this paper. So let's think about why and how a protest succeeds. So to save the world, theta is going to represent the strength of the regime or status quo. Everything in this paper will be uniform. So theta is also going to be drawn uniform. We'll call the bounds little m and big M before the game begins. And this is agent's common prior. So protest that uses tactic tau with turnout L is going to succeed if the power generated is greater than theta. So this is standard. And we're going to think about the decision being made by a success maximizing organizer. So you can think about this organizer's payoff being one if the protest succeeds at any point in its lifetime and zero otherwise. So let's just recap the timeline of the model before we keep going. So before the game begins, theta is drawn, uniform. The organization's tactic is inherited. This is not updated. Sorry, this should read the organization's tactic is determined by the organizer. I was messing with this a little bit. Then costs are drawn and agents choose whether or not to join the protest based on their realized cost. Then protest occurs. Agents observe the tactic, the size of mobilization, so power, and the outcome. So if we succeed or fail, and flow payoffs are realized. So if the protest succeeds, the game ends, and if not, next period's tactics are chosen and we repeat from step one. Of course, if it's a second time period, then the game ends no matter what. And the solution concept is PvE.
No, so Elaine, I'm sorry. So
Mhm.
tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. So there are two separate groups of protesters, and if you choose one tactic, only one type is gonna join, gonna decide whether to join or not. And if you choose the other tactic, that's the other group. Is that?
Yeah, so that is how the model is literally written.
Uh-huh.
But I encourage you to not take this assumption too literally. So you could imagine that there's some players that draw both costs, or indeed that all players draw both costs, and only one cost is essentially activated each period
Okay.
by the choice of the tactical organizer. I think it's cleaner analytically to think about two separate groups, but I don't want this to be a kind of literal assumption.
All right. Thank you.
Can I follow also on the same question?
Yes.
Uh, is there a way to see it as there's one group of people, but they are coordinated by some kind of central protest authority who decides who decides the type, that's the tactic, and then they turn off and turn on either this one or that one.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, you could exactly see it that way. Um,
Okay.
So this was the objection I kind of saw coming. So don't take this assumption a little too literally. As Max pointed out, you could see it as a group of people, but your realized cost depends on the tactic chosen by the central protest authority. Another possibly objectionable assumption in this model is that the individual cost is redrawn each period, right? So it's not correlated across periods. If my cost today is high, it doesn't imply that it's going to be high tomorrow. This is a strong stylization. I've thought about ways to get around it. And if you have ideas, I'm all ears. But I think as we'll see, this is necessary to recover the kind of appealing properties that we're gonna want to get back to in this model. Another objection that you could come up with is that the government is not an active player. This is because the meat of the model is really to think about what we learn from protest itself rather than protest and strategic risk repression. But we could also think about, for instance, what the government would choose if it could interfere with tactic technologies. And you could also think about costs as embedding the severity of repression. Um, and with two periods, it's there to sharpen intuitions. I do want to emphasize that uniqueness result would also apply with an arbitrary or infinite number of periods, but it's most kind of tractable to think about too.
Can I
So
ask,
for that, Mhm.
the data is observable by everyone once it's drawn, or
No,
is it?
no. So theta is drawn, but we don't observe it. So the key is
Right.
that we're going to learn about theta based on the fact that we're going to throw a protest against theta. and see whether or not it succeeds or fails. And if it fails, then we learn, oh, theta must have been stronger than that protest we threw against it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So you can't, but even at the first, okay, so you wanna emphasize this learning process.
Yes.
Okay, right.
So
Okay.
is turnout observable?
Yes. So turnout is observable and tactic is observable. So
Okay.
even if we just assumed that you only observe power, given that you observe power and tactic, then you could back out turnout too. So we might as well assume that turnout is observable. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, essentially the first thing I want to do is unpack this closely bundled ingredients of turnout, learning, and path dependence. This will give us a nice uniqueness result, and then we'll kind of throw tactical choice back into the mix and think about that, how that interacts with the learning process that we're going to start off talking about. So let me state for you some facts that describe fundamental properties of this game that abstract away from tactical choice. So for now, set aside tactical choice. Let's just think about what happens when we have this repeated protest that happens. So in the stage game, I'm going to show you that individuals are going to protest if their cost is less than some threshold. Each failed protest makes your beliefs about about theta, the strength of the regime, more pessimistic. So what that means is that this threshold for participation is going to become lower each time, right? It can only ever be that we become more pessimistic in this game, and that's going to drive this threshold to become harder to reach, right? It's going to be more difficult for your cost to be lower than C hat T. However, this is not a deterministic kind of finding because these population costs are redrawn each period. So it could be that even though C hat T is much lower in the second period, we draw a really kind of lucky draw of the common shock, which means that in fact a lot of people have costs lower than C hat T. So it's possible to see a kind of temporary or kind of spurious increase in mobilization. This is the kind of path dependence that's possible in this model. And a kind of idea that we can get from this is that essentially, as I put it a little melodramatically, medium-sized protests tend to die premature deaths. And what I mean by this is essentially that the range of thetas that you contest is going to be lower if you have a sort of medium-sized protest, because you're learning a lot about theta, which drives down participation, but you're not actually kind of contesting a lot of the ranges of thetas that you could be contesting. I think I'll talk about this again in a future slide and make this a bit more rigorous. So why heterogeneity in costs and not beliefs about regime strength? I've made this pitch already. But essentially, the point of my setup is to decouple global games properties from beliefs about theta. So the point of this whole setup is to take public beliefs as given each period and then play a relatively standard global game over your realized cost of participation. And this is why it's possible to have participation that's cut off in your realization of cost. So lemma 1 is where the magic happens. So an agent of type tau with cost c tau it is going to participate in a line protest at time t if and only if their realized cost is less than this thing that I'm calling c hat tau t. And the nice thing about this expression, if you look at it a little bit, and sorry, I should have mentioned that F is the CDF of theta. So this is essentially telling me this is describing my beliefs about theta. We can think of C hat as essentially a weighted average of expected tactic success. It's saying for any given realization of turnout, what is the power that would be generated by this turnout? And then F of that is telling me the likelihood that power would be over the bar. So the likelihood that this would succeed. And then I'm kind of averaging this over all the realizations of turnout. And this is really where the magic happens because this is what couples beliefs, your beliefs about theta, which are indexed by F, with participation decisions in a pretty intuitive way. And a sort of immediate or sort of implication of this is this fact that we're always becoming more pessimistic over time. So C hat is an average over beliefs. And if time 2 beliefs about theta, FOSD time 1 beliefs, which is to say each protest is kind of cutting out a range of lower thetas from the support. So becoming more and more convinced that the regime is strong. This average is going down, right? Because the average is an average over expected success. So the more I believe theta is likely to be high, the less kind of likely it is overall, kind of on average, it is that a protest is going to succeed. This is an important property of the game, so I hope that's clear. So the key takeaway is that increasing pessimism from failed protests is going to drive down this cost threshold, making it more difficult to reach.
Elaine, sorry, can you remind me what rho tau is?
Oh, that's vestigial. I'm sorry. This should not exist anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm sorry. I should have looked
No
at that more
Sorry,
carefully.
I have a naive question. So this pessimism
Mhm.
feature, how does that prevent the dynamic where we end up having a protest that slowly builds up, which is
Yes, right. So one thing that you cannot generate with this model without tactical choice is kind of momentum. So you could see kind of spurious increases in the size of a protest because the cost shock is redrawn each period, right? So it could be that even though we're becoming kind of more pessimistic, today is a national holiday for whatever reason, something happens and we become very inclined to join. So that is possible, but this is not a model in which we get sort of building momentum. The only news that
Thank you.
arrives is bad news.
Thanks.
So the kind of gift of this setup is that essentially given a realization or a path of cost shocks, there is a unique equilibrium. And I want to make the pitch that this would stick if you wanted to use this framework for more than 2 periods. And if we introduce tactics and a procedure for how tactics are chosen, for instance, that they're chosen by. So the gift of this setup, as I might be retreading old ground here, is that given a path of cost shocks, we recover a unique equilibrium. And I want to make the pitch that this is a framework you could use for things other than tactical choice. So if you wanted to write a multi-period or infinite period model, you could kind of plug and play with what I've introduced so far. So kind of proposition one, which is the uniqueness result, is given tactic-specific cost shock realizations, tactics and preferences of the tactic chooser, choice of tactics and mobilizations, each period is unique. So that is sort of the existence result that makes the rest of this paper possible. So let me tell you what I mean by this path dependence result. So let's think about what happens if we have a really kind of good draw of cost today. So if we have a really good draw, we result in really large mobilization. So suppose everybody, in fact, turns out. This is a really large, this means that the protest succeeds almost surely. But if we actually fail, beliefs shift a lot, but accurately. So the idea behind this is that we've kind of contested all the possible thetas that we ever had a chance of contesting at all. So there was no kind of waste. What happens, on the other hand, if we have a really high draw of cost? That means that very few people show up. We have a tiny little protest, which has a very low probability of success. But precisely because this protest is so small, we don't learn very much from it. We learned, okay, so theta is not this really small slice down here at the bottom of the support, but there's still all these other thetas out there that we haven't learned anything about, so beliefs are not significantly affected. So we sort of have the same chance of tomorrow as of generating a large protest as we did today. The problem happens when we have a kind of intermediate draw of C tau T. So this is a little bit hand wavy, but think about it as follows. We have a medium-sized mobilization. A bunch of people showed up. Okay, there were TV cameras. We saw that this happened, but they didn't do anything. The process was unsuccessful. And the problem with this kind of protest is that it influences beliefs enough to discourage mobilization in the future because we cut out a lot of possible thetas. We left a lot on the table. And I think I took this out of the slides, but you can show in a kind of computational example that the sort of total probability of success is lower when we have this kind of intermediate initial draw of C tau T. So this is the idea that sort of medium-sized protests die sort of, I don't know exactly how I put it melodramatically, but essentially that when we have these medium-sized initial protests, these leave more values of theta on the table. They leave them uncontested compared to a really high realization of the cost or really low realization of the cost. And as you can imagine, just thinking forward a little bit, this kind of path dependence result is going to matter a lot more when the tactic is more sensitive to turnout. So you can think about how tactical choice is going to interact with this path dependence result. See, Francesco unmuted himself. Does he have a question?
Yeah. So I was going to ask, so yes, but if you have, I agree with all the intuitions you've given, but if you have a very high theta and you did not succeed, it
Mhm.
still means that you're basically facing somebody who is unbeatable. And
Mhm.
so your next cost realization, because you're also assuming they're independent,
Mhm.
at some point I'll discuss that with you because I think you could do something about momentum by playing with those. But
Okay.
the thing about yeah. So I mean, you learn a lot. You have a very good idea. You know that in principle, if the theta hadn't been so high, you would have been able to do a lot of stuff and so on. But effectively, I mean, you don't allow them to give up. So I guess whatever
I
tactic
don't,
you get,
so they don't
yeah.
give up, but
Mm,
C hat, so suppose that huge protest that fails, theta must be unbeatable. What that means
mm,
is that C hat gets driven down into the ground. So only those
mm,
people that would protest no matter what, because they're on this side of the two-sided limit dominance, only those people are going to show up. So actually,
mm,
what you're saying does kind of happen, and it happens through
mm.
that C hat threshold.
Yeah, no, but what I'm saying is, it's
Not
you
quite.
learn a lot. What I'm trying to say is, you learn a lot, but you can't do very much with it because it's just you learn that there's nothing you can do in a way. That's
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, so this thing about leaving more values of theta uncontested compared to high or low realizations, I'm not sure about the high value of theta in that sense. You see what I mean? That's what I was trying to get
I
at.
mean, that is path dependent, right? So, but my
Yeah.
point is essentially when we don't learn very much, the
Mm,
chances tomorrow are just as good as they were today before we
mm,
actually pulled a seed,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
it
yeah,
means that
yeah.
we haven't kind of shot ourselves in the foot for tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Okay, great. So I want to now, okay, I've moved this bar to the wrong place. Okay, I now want to reintroduce tactical choice. So what do these kind of fundamental properties of the game imply when we kind of reintroduce choice between two tactics that have these differing sensitivities to turnout? So the first thing I want to do is to establish some intuitions regarding retrospective and prospective incentives, and then this is maybe overselling what I have, but start thinking about comparative statics. So I want to first pitch that there's a very obvious experimentation logic at work here, right? Agents are learning about the goodness of their options in light of what they've tried before. So let's think about the effects of mounting pessimism, right? Each failed protest eats away at part of the distribution. You think the regime is more and more likely to be strong. And this, as we know now, eats away at expected turnout because C hat, this cost threshold, is an average over expected success given the distribution your posterior about theta. So, when turnout is low, these disruptive or violent or insurgent tactics are more powerful than people power, right? Remember when turnout is zero, disruptive tactics are more powerful. So this should imply that protest movements should suffer a sort of long, violent tail. No, you're probably shaking your head because you're smart. Because theta, sorry, that should say, oh, so when theta is more likely high, that also implies that disruptive protests at any level are less likely to succeed, right? So remember that we assumed that when turnout is really high, the sort of maximum power of these mass tactics or people power tactics is higher than disruptive tactics. So this kind of implies a trade-off between tactics. At some point, these disruptive tactics might be futile, even if everybody participated, disruption is below the support of our beliefs about theta. So that suggests that when first period protests are extremely strong or kind of in an implied limit as t goes to infinity, protests should gamble on people power, right? Even if high turnout is unlikely, that's the only tactic that could feasibly succeed. So this is just scratching the surface of the kind of experimentation logic that it's the model. We're going to come back to this in a slightly more sophisticated form shortly. But I also want to plug that this is a sort of natural extension of the path dependence result, right? It implies that to some extent, tactical choice is not always deterministic, but it's contingent on the realization of the cost shock. So in the version of the game we first thought about that didn't have tactical choice, there's no way to sort of re-optimize given unfavorable outcomes of a cost shock. But when we introduce tactical choice, you can still kind of make the most of pessimistic beliefs by switching to a less turnout sensitive tactic. The next mechanism I want to highlight is, to me, a more interesting mechanism, which has to do with managing public optimism. So I want to tell you that the protest organizer wants to avoid sabotaging their future prospects, even if this means choosing a tactic that does not maximize short-term success. And to see this most cleanly, to really isolate this mechanism, let's think about an extreme case in which the disruptive tactic is completely insensitive to turnout. So the AD function is entirely flat. So that's what the red dotted line is here. And I want to ask you if a success maximizing social planner would ever choose to use the disruptive tactic first, even if it was extremely powerful. So even if tactics looked like this. I'll give you like a kind of second to think, but the answer is no. And the reason is because using this kind of flat tactic first is essentially going to handicap the sort of people power tactic that's available to you tomorrow, right? So what happens when protest fails today? If protest fails today, as we know, your beliefs are going to become pessimistic. You're going to think the regime is strong, and that's going to depress turnout tomorrow and therefore weaken the power of the peaceful or the people power tactic. By contrast, using sorry, I was messing with language here. Using the people power tactic first allows you to use the strongest version of that tactic that you have and still gives you the option of using the disruptive tactic tomorrow. So if we look at this, think about the fact that only one of these tactics is responsive to turnout. So if only one of these is responsive to turnout, we should use that responsive tactic when expected turnout is likely to be highest given our beliefs about theta, right? And that sort of flat line essentially tells us that we can use the other tactic whenever, and its expected sort of power is not going to vary at all. So the sort of punchline of this is that when one of the tactics is completely insensitive to turnout, you should never use it first if you're a success maximizing organizer, even if that tactic is extremely, extremely powerful. I thought this was pretty interesting, so I want to sort of like pitch it one more time. And I think this is interesting because it's essentially telling us that this model is almost the model of experimentation where the arms are changing endogenously, right? So the version of the peaceful or people power tactic that's available on day one is not the same as that tactic sort of that's available on day two, or you could think about an implied long run on day 3 or 4. So it's an interesting dynamic because the efficacy of a tactic changes over time, and that's related to how sensitive the turnout that tactic is. And this is really being underpinned by the logic of collective action, right? It's really being underpinned by the fact that each agent is deciding whether or not they want to join this protest. The organizer can only choose a tactic. He can't force anybody to show up. But the technology available to the organizer is changing based on these individually rational decisions.
So
Question. Yes.
yeah, can I? So
Please.
part of this reasoning kind of goes through your assumption that the organizer only cares about the success of the protest and nothing else, right? So I'm just wondering, like, there is an extension of this model where the organizer also takes these like total costs that are paid into the account, right?
Yes.
Do you think these conclusions are robust to that extension?
No, I don't think so. Right. So I think that if you did care about, if you also cared about, for instance, the cost of participation, you can imagine hand-waving logic here, but you can imagine kind of wanting to save your agents the possibility of having to pay the cost of showing up. And that would sort of distort your
Yeah,
decision to use the sort of participatory tactic first.
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why ultimately I do think organizational structure could be an interesting
Yeah.
gloss on these, because this is a very sort of, I think, pretty strong result, but you can imagine that it's not sensitive or it's not robust to exactly what you described.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
This is just following up. This is perhaps a cheap comment but you could have discounting in your model of time. So
Yeah.
you want to get there as quick. In the limit, this would be the static model, right? You have one shot and then you don't care. So in a way, I can see why you want to emphasize. You don't want to have discounting because you want to emphasize the dynamics, I suppose.
Mm.
But yeah, if you added discounting, then some of these intuitions would go away, depending on the discount factor, I guess,
Fair enough.
because you want to get it done as quickly as possible, right? Which is another version of caring about the costs, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. That's correct. Okay. So now we wander, unfortunately, into the speculative and work in progress part of this talk. So if you have ideas, please tell me at this point, because this part of the talk sort of verges into untrodden territory. So what I want to think about is, we have these two pretty strong results about both sort of experimentation and managing public optimism. And I want to think about the conditions under which each of these kind of plays a larger role in driving tactical choice. And as I kind of flagged in the beginning, I want to think about when are we more likely to see sort of alternation or more prevalent mass tactics or more prevalent kind of insurgent tactics. So substantively, the reason why this is like a reasonable thing to think about for political scientists is that, Mark Beissinger's book, which I quoted from before, really talks about how changes in living patterns really change the overarching form of revolutions. So in rural societies, we predominantly saw these violent armed rebellions versus in urbanized societies, and we have, millions of people living in a city. We see instead a predominance of mass, unarmed, what he calls civic revolutions. So it makes sense to use this kind of model to think about not only if we can rationalize that observation, but also what we can say about sort of intra-protest tactical choice, given different kind of technologies that are available to us. So just to flag where I'm going, can we use the model to think about how learning drives intra-movement experimentation and tactical change or entrenchment in different contexts? So the first thing I want to think about is, when does learning actually matter? So we can think about tactical choice being learning sensitive when what you choose in the second period depends strongly on what happened in the first period. So this operates through two mechanisms, and the first one we already saw. It's really direct, right? We just learn about what theta is, and if theta is more powerful than the most powerful version of the disruptive tactic that we have, then we should definitely not use this. But that is kind of like a very crude reading of the model, because there's also an indirect way in which learning is effective here, right? Which is that your posterior beliefs about theta affect the kind of cost thresholds for both tactics. And those are different, right? Because remember, the cost threshold embeds the tactical technology, and therefore the likely realization of turnout next period. So for now, let's ignore any possible differences in the distribution of the aggregate shocks across tactics. Let's assume the support is the same for each and think about how this kind of learning occurs. So let's go back and just briefly review some of the concepts that are really driving things here, right? So a tactic maps mobilization to power, and I'm going to let A1 denote the size of the first period protest. The probability of period 2 success induces a cost cutoff, which is an average over all possible realizations of turnout. So here's a slightly more sort of, just plugging in the uniform distribution assumption to the C hat that we saw before. That's all that this is. And the C hat is then going to induce expected mobilization, right? So given that we know what the cost threshold is today, we can predict how many people are going to show up tomorrow. So the punchline of all this is that when C hat is larger, so when C hat is kind of more flexible, that induces a rightward shift in the distribution of induced or expected mobilization. So essentially, the more favorable C hat is, the more that we expect that a lot of people are going to show up. So because the probability of success is increasing in mobilization, which tactic has the larger C hat, so which tactic has the more kind of favorable cost threshold, is really decisive. So here's a conjecture, which I think is true, but I haven't proven it yet. So if for all feasible, so all possible first period protests that we could have actually realized, if the cost threshold is higher for the people power tactic relative to the disruptive tactic, then, again, for all those feasible first period protests, expected success for the second period protest under the sort of people power tactic is going to be higher, right? So that tactic is going to yield a higher probability of success no matter what the realization of first period protest was. So what this conjecture is essentially telling us, this intuition is not particularly substantively useful, but what this conjecture is telling us is that under some conditions, which are the conditions of the C hat dominance, it doesn't actually really matter what you learn. Your second period decision is fixed either way. So here's some numerical examples. Does learning matter with tactics like these? So here's some examples of tactics where they're extremely close, but they satisfy the assumptions that we saw before, right? So the peaceful tactic is in the blue line and disruptive tactic is the dotted red line. So does learning matter with tactics like these? The answer here is no. So the right-hand plot is plotting the size of the first period protest. So on the x-axis are all the first period protests we could have realized against expected success of the period 2 protest. And we can see that in this line, the sort of people power tactic has a higher expected success than the disruptive tactic, even though it looks like they're extremely close. This should be a little bit surprising. Let's think about this a little bit more in a second. But let's look at a different example. So does learning matter with tactics like these? So this is a different example in which the tactics are very different, right? So it's very obvious that at lower realizations of turnout, the disruptive tactic is a lot more powerful. And it turns out that yes, in this case, tactical choice in the second period is responsive to what happened in the first period. So again, what the right-hand side graph is telling us is that for, say, a really small size of the first period protest, you would rather use disruptive tactics second, whereas for really large realizations of the first period protest, you would rather use the people power tactics second. And that kind of makes sense, right? If we learn that the regime is really strong, it seems like the only thing that should possibly succeed, again, is that larger turnout sensitive tactic. But I want to argue that what's underlying both of these examples is exactly C hat dominance. So in the first example, even though it looks like those tactics are extremely close, the turnout sensitive tactic has C hat dominance. Whereas in the second example, where they're really different, we can see that sometimes C hat for the disruptive tactic is higher than C hat for the people power tactic. So what I'm plotting here is, again, on the x-axis, the size of the first period protest, and on the y-axis, the induced cost threshold for both tactics. And I think this is useful to think about because it tells us some slightly unintuitive things, right? So when I was messing around and looking at, for instance, the example 1, where the two tactics are extremely close, my initial conjecture is that it should be that actually tactical choice is really, really dependent on what happens in the first period. But it turns out that because of C hat dominance, that's not true. And the point here is that these kind of point-wise comparisons of tactics at low levels of mobilizations can be pretty misleading, right? Even similar looking tactics can still produce sort of global or C hat dominance when one has a uniformly larger C hat. And the intuition here is that that sort of extra bit of win probability really matters to C hat when the first period protest is strong. So sort of the sort of area under the curve at really like high levels of first period protest matters disproportionately to what CHAT is. And that's really what's driving the sort of slightly counterintuitive things that are happening in the first example. So what this suggests to me, to try to bring it back a little bit, is that second period tactical choices should be more variable and path dependent when tactics don't display CHAT dominance, i.e., and I have to formalize this, when there's more separation between their performance. So when we have things more like the example 2 tactics, where the tactics are very separated, the disruptive tactic is much more powerful at low levels of turnout, much less powerful at high levels of turnout. So those are the examples where we should see sort of more path dependence. Okay, so now we enter into really speculative territory, but these are things that I think are really interesting, especially for the kind of application of this model. And one thing that I think is cool is that you can see that the disruptive tactic is kind of curtailing learning because there's a very limited range of thetas that you can contest. So think again about what happens when the disruptive tactic is completely flat. You know exactly what it's going to be, and you know exactly that it's going to tell you either that theta is above this bar or below this bar. So you can imagine that, for instance, if we had more than 2 periods and a very powerful, appealing disruptive tactic, then beliefs are not really moving much from period to period. They get pessimistic and they stay there. And this is very different from what we could imagine happens in kind of urban civic revolutions, where there's extreme path dependence, where what you learn from a protest is very, very, very sensitive to the realization of the cost shock. And under certain conditions that we just talked about, this learning might well matter a lot to what you choose tomorrow. And the model also seems to imply that another extreme is possible, right? When both tactics are almost identically responsive to turnout, so that first kind of surprising numerical example I showed you, learning just isn't very useful even when it happens. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what I was thinking about with respect to organizational concerns. So all this logic was hinging on the behavior of a success maximizing organizer, but we could also think about a biased leader whose payoff is tied to using a specific tactic. I think Arda mentioned a welfare maximizing leader who cares about the payoffs of agents, so the costs that they incur, rather than just win probability. And we could also think about incumbent protesters thinking about, are we going to stick with the tactic that we have today, or are we going to try to pass the torch? So I want to think a little bit about what we might get when we allow incumbents rather than success maximizing social planner to choose tactics. I have a little bit of time to talk about this, so let me just tell you what I think might happen. So there's a first order distortion, which basically comes from the fact that we have private benefits, right? So private benefits are leading us to hopefully inefficiently entrench in our tactics because we want to be part of the sort of winning protest. On the other hand, the likelihood of paying participation costs is kind of a push factor, right? It's pushing us to maybe try to hand it over to somebody else who can incur this cost. And as the likelihood of success diminishes, the likelihood of both of these is decreasing, right? You only acquire private benefits if you participate, but participation incurs paying this participation cost. But it's a little asymmetric because private benefits are contingent on participation and success, whereas paying a cost is only contingent on participation. So this is kind of implying that maybe paying costs eventually is going to sort of outweigh the private benefits kind of side of this calculation. I also think there might be potentially more indirect distortions that are inherently dynamic, and this kind of goes to Francesco's a comment about discounting, right? So the social planner only cares about the potential lifetime of the protest. But incumbents might sometimes be tempted to free ride off of others. They might disproportionately prioritize the duration of the protest in which they're likely to be participants relative to when they're sitting on the sidelines. So I don't have more to say here. This is just kind of me flagging what might be possible when we introduce these kind of less efficient organizational decision-making structures relative to the success maximizing social planner. Okay, so I have 3 minutes left, so it seems a good time to wrap up. So what I've shown you today is a model where learning from past protests, participation in present, and kind of possibilities for the future are very tightly bundled. And I think this is interesting because tactical choice offers a technological lever, essentially the hedge against bad news. Both bad news that we realize based on what happened yesterday and bad things that could happen tomorrow. And this is offering us a way of thinking about intra-movement dynamics under different sort of social and technological conditions. I obviously have a lot of work left to do, but eventually I would like to think about, again, different decision makers, including incumbents. Thank you for your time. Your comments and suggestions are extremely, extremely welcome.
Hey, Elaine, thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes. I let Elaine speak because we had that interruption, but a couple of minutes before we stop recording, I guess. But if somebody has a question before we stop the recording, that would be great.
I could
just unmute yourselves. Yeah, Max.
You can. I think you can turn your video on. I think my internet might be back. Actually, came back at some point.
Since we have a minute, I have a question that I should have asked earlier, but it kind of will help me understand the basic part of the model.
Okay.
So global games for protests are used in order to solve this coordination problem that is inherent in protests. So that gives us essentially perhaps a unique equilibrium because the coordination is solved. Here, on the other hand, you're assuming that, or at least that's my interpretation of the model that you have, is that there's this leadership that coordinates, a tactical choice. So that's another way of solving a coordination problem. We pick a leader and a leader tells us whether we protest or not. So I'm trying to figure out, do you need global games at all to, once you commit to leadership, do you need global games? And if you don't want to commit to leadership, then maybe there should be three choices for the participants, protest or not protest. And if protest, then what kind of protest? And then a global game to solve that coordination problem. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a good question to think about. So my interpretation of how a lot of protests go down is somebody says, "Oh, there's going to be a march tomorrow," or "We're going to throw tomatoes at a Van Gogh painting tomorrow." But then it's really up to individuals to decide whether or not they want to participate in this. So just because somebody announced that there is a march doesn't mean that a lot of people are going to show up to this march. So it seems realistic from my perspective that somebody can say, this is the kind of technology that we're going to use. It's up to you whether or not you actually want to show up and make this technology efficacious. So I think that makes sense. And the reason why I've been sort of heavily emotionally invested in the incumbent extension is because I think that is kind of capturing what you're saying. So it's not exactly the same order of moves, but it is saying, okay, we showed up today, we tried something and it didn't work. Do we think it's a good idea to stick to this, or do we think it'd be a better idea to let somebody else take over? So I think in many cases, it does seem like incumbents have a strong say in the kind of tactics that are used next period, right? Whether or not we stick with this or whether or not we try something else. And that's the reason why I still think that hopefully should be part of the paper eventually. But that is not quite what you were saying, right? It's not quite saying we get together, we choose tactics, and then we kind of choose the protest right afterwards.
I'll push back after we'll say goodbyes officially.
Okay, looking forward to it.
All right, well, let's say our goodbyes officially, but just after that, I won't let you push back yet because I have questions too.
Okay.
And actually, I want to give other people who are not organizers a chance to ask a question.